And now we're going to hear the interview that Patrick talked about with Kim Dorr-Tilley.
Well, we're basically going back across the ocean in a sense. We're in the United States, actually in the hills above Hollywood at the Bel Air Church with Kim Dorr-Tilley, who's an associate pastor there. And I have to tell you, there are times during that interview that you're going to feel moved to tears. Her inspiration is incredible. And I got to tell you, when you're in Hollywood and you're trying to save souls in Hollywood, it's a tall order. It's kind of a crazy place. So this interview is enormously impactful, and I'm really, really excited to share it with you. Kim, I want to say thanks so much for inviting us to this beautiful location here in Los Angeles to have this conversation. I'd like to start out by just having you tell me a bit about your background and what brought you to where you are today.
Sure. My name is Kim Dorr-Tilley, and currently I'm one of the associate pastors here at Bel Air Presbyterian Church in Los Angeles. And in a tiny nutshell, I came out to LA actually to be a wife and mother. I had pursued acting when I was back in Denver, Colorado. Thought I'd be a classical theater actress, and I met an actor back there, and his path was to come out to LA. So very young, came out with that intention of starting a family. That did not pan out, and when I got out to LA, knew nobody, and got a job at a production company that grew very quickly into being a casting director. So from a casting director, I became a talent agent, owned my own talent agency, and so I had a career in entertainment for about 35 years. And concurrently with that, this incredible thing happened where I became a Christian. Became a Christian right before my 30th birthday. And this journey with God, with my Lord, started really picking up steam, and experienced a call to ministry, and went to seminary here in LA, and kept thinking that God would end my career in entertainment and begin a career in ministry, and his plan was actually to weave those together. And so I actually spent 10 years as an associate pastor and as a talent agency owner, which is one of the strangest hyphenates that people have ever heard of.
I'd say it's quite unusual.
Yeah.
What was it that happened that when you were roughly 30, I think you said, that that changed your life?
Well, I can mention that I got divorced. And it was, I got married very young. I got married when I was 21. And there was a lot of, you know, what your mind and your heart attach itself to, of what you want this to be. You want this to be your knight in shining armor. You want this to be a safe place, and it wasn't. So my 20s were they were hard on me emotionally, because there really wasn't a safe place. And when I got out to LA, I kind of got sucked right into the New Age movement. Being from Colorado, I think that I absolutely had some sense of a creator God. It's hard to look at the Rocky Mountains and not go, wow, and feel something other than, hey, that's a rock. There is something that's testifying to something. And I grew up with that, but we were Christmas, Easter when I grew up. We didn't talk about Jesus. And so when I got out here, being spiritual without having any grounding, I was ripe for the New Age movement. And right when I got to LA is when Shirley MacLaine and her book Out on a Limb was out, and Deepak Chopra, and there was so much about the spirit world. And so I was so open to that, and found in the context of such a hardship in my emotional life with my marriage, that I was in a very conscious pursuit of knowing the name of my spirit guide. And that was all New Age driven. I used to say out loud, there's truth on the other side, and if I could just reach it, that, whatever that wisdom and truth is, it will help me where I am right now. And I believed that. I don't know why I believed it, but I believed it. And I would go to as many places and talk to as many people with really one question. And that question was, who is my spirit guide?
Right.
And never got an answer. I can tell you about your past lives. I can tell you about your auras. It's like, I don't really care that much. But I do care about who my spirit guide is. I want a name. I want a name. And I felt like if I could get the name, that wisdom would start pouring into my life, and I'd have some path of how to get out what was really difficult for me. And went through this divorce, the marriage ended, and right about the same time, one of my best friends, who was raised Christian but had not been walking out her faith, was not connected to her faith when we met, she had some events in her life, and she came back to her faith. She rededicated herself to being a follower of Jesus Christ. So now I've got this friend of mine who's talking to me about Jesus, and I am the person going, how could a Christian believe that? How could a Christian believe this? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And I kept engaging her in conversations, debunking her.
Right.
And this culminated with me calling her up one night and saying, do you want to hang out? And she was looking for a church to join, and she said, well, I'm going to go to a church tonight. Do you want to come? Yeah, sure, I don't care. It could have been a bowling alley, could have been a bar. I just wanted to hang out with my friend. And on the way to church that night, she said, well, I said to her, I said, you know, I don't like it that you look at me and think I'm wrong. And she said, oh, I don't think of you as wrong. I think of you as distracted from the path. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, well, she said, do you want to know how I pray for you when I pray for you? And now this is like, that's like somebody saying, you want to know what you look like when you sleep? I'm like, that's weird. You pray for me? What do you pray for me? And she said, Kim, I feel pain in my body, physical pain in my body when I pray for you. She said, I have never met anybody more determined to find a path that you know is there. You know it's there. So when I pray for you, I see you in this jungle, running through this jungle, and you're tripping over roots and branches or slapping into you, and you're getting bloodied and bruised, looking for what you know is there, and you keep getting up and running deeper into a jungle. She said, I'm standing on the path that you're looking for, and somebody else got bloodied and bruised for me, and his name is Jesus. We pull into the parking lot, we walk into the church, and that night, the preacher was talking about people that had been distracted from the path.
Wow.
And a light bulb went on. I was born again. I received that as revelation. I knew that it was God speaking to me, and what God said was all of this pursuit of trying to find the name was instantly in my mind, like snapshots of all the things I had pursued. And hearing the name Jesus in this first time, in this context of, he's not this person to debunk, he is Lord and Savior. I felt God in my spirit say, you weren't prepared to hear that name, and I was not prepared to give you away. And right then it was very clear to me of these realms, the occult, what God says about that, and how that Jesus was my Lord and Savior, my Savior before I ever knew it. Because some really bad things could have happened to me, and they didn't. So I gave my life to him that night.
Do you feel like you still have a clear context for what life was like for you, or just what your perceptions were, perspective was prior to being born again?
Yeah, I absolutely do.
So like, in other words, you can still relate to that person. And do you see it in other people now?
Absolutely. Especially here in Hollywood. Part of my calling to ministry was specifically to the entertainment industry. And so that's a significant part of my adult life. And there are so many people that are so open spiritually and aware that there is something transcendent around us. I think there's very few atheists. There's probably a lot more agnostics. But I think you got to go a long way before you find someone that says, I do not, I will not, I don't want to hear, I'm set against this. I think part of, the artistic community, when you're working with, actors and writers and directors and cinematographers and people that are involved with creating truth, beauty, transcendence, that's a very thin place between art and God. Yeah. And that's what I was called to, is to be a translator.
And I think that's the point, because, in a sense, is it a blessing in your mind that you had the journey, that you didn't just grow up and stay there the whole time, but you can see through the lens of people who are also maybe in pain or searching or feel that void in their life. And maybe, especially in people who are in Hollywood, in the entertainment industry. So what is it like to minister to them?
If there are people of faith, then you minister in that shared faith, where we point to faith, hope, and love, and live in that, and remind each other, like, oh yeah, that is who I am. That is what I believe, and I believe it in a way that reorients me to whatever realities I'm facing. When you're in relationship with people that haven't had an experience with a transcendent, personal God, their only experience of that is who you are. How are you in relationship with them, in integrity and honesty, in authentically caring? And I'm so glad that God actually opened a door to being a talent agent for me before ministry, because it sounds funny, but I think a heart of ministry was born out of being a talent agent. As a talent agent, you are an advocate for someone else 24/7. You are seeking their best interest. You are trying to help what they most want in life come to fruition. And when they shoot themselves in the foot, you're the one that leaps in front of it and say that they didn't do that, that was my fault. And something that was very profound for me in being someone's representative. And if you just think of that word, I am your representative. I'm going to stand for you when I talk about you in this industry. And that's akin to who Jesus is. Jesus is our representative when it comes to taking the full brunt of what we should have taken, of this judgment of God. Jesus says, I'm going to step in front of that for you, and I'm going to represent you to God out of my righteousness, and that's who God's going to see. So I know you probably don't get many people comparing talent agents to Jesus, and certainly not to over religionize or Christianize my role, but it was a place where there was ministry that nobody knew was ministry. It's just, how are you loving that person?
Well, it's a unique place to be, because if we're dealing with Hollywood, you're dealing with celebrities, you're dealing with industry that influences culture, right? And the masses, and that could have political implications, right? It has moral implications. It has, all kinds of impact on generations and how they're going to behave or what they're going to think. So how do you see it? And what is it like? Because this is a very unique position to be in Hollywood doing what you're doing, having the background, of, like you said, as being a talent agent and a casting agent, et cetera, having that background and now saying, okay, I've got a different calling, but yet you're bringing this calling back to the group or the culture from which you came. So can you describe that a little bit, because it's very unique?
Well, I'll try, yes. One of the first things when we started this ministry, to and for people working in the entertainment industry, of, God always seeks us. And so we wanted to be a church that seeks people who think that the church might not want to have anything to do with them. So that was just living an incarnational ministry. But one of the first things that we really landed on was focusing on significance in Hollywood. so much of the mindset in Hollywood is on success. How can I be successful? And you're rewarded for success, and people love you when you're successful, and they drop you like a hot potato as soon as you're not. And people get very objectified in Hollywood. You're an object. You're either, as an agent, I'm either an obstacle or a tool that's gonna help somebody get where they wanna go. And we objectify people all the time in the entertainment industry. We buy and sell people, you know, and when you hire an actor, that's what you're doing. You are looking at them and dehumanizing them in some ways by saying, you know, this color of hair works better than that color of hair or whatever. Significance is not related to success. You can be significant when you're standing in line at Trader Joe's and you help that person pick up whatever they just dropped. Or, you know, their child's crying, and rather than giving them a dirty look, you actually try to help them. Right. It's something that inhabits every minute of who you are, so that for people, you know, success in Hollywood comes and goes. You can be at the top of your game and a year later have nobody returning your calls. And if those are your circumstances, you can lose your identity quickly. Significance grounds you always. You never lose your identity. When you are focused on why God has you in certain places, be they great circumstances or lousy circumstances, there's something that adds significance to your life and through your life then to every encounter that you have. When you talk about influence, culture is upstream of politics. You know, there's so many people that lobbyists in Washington are there to affect platforms and laws. But before you can affect laws, you have to affect people's thinking. What are they passionate about and why? Well, it's stories that help shape what we love, what we believe, humanity. From the longest time that we can remember, we have told stories. Stories that shape our reality. That bring reality into focus. And so it's when we think of story, sometimes you can think of, oh, that's made up.
Right.
Or actually story, the mega narrative of humans is so anchored in who we are and what we will die for. We die for conceptual things a lot of the time. And so when Hollywood produces stories, they can be humanizing or they can be dehumanizing. So I'm not using right or wrong or good or bad, but do I feel more profoundly human as a result of that story, or do I feel somehow more objectified? Either how I feel or what I just watched. And there are so many people here in Hollywood who aren't even necessarily people of faith that are telling very humanizing stories, that are reaching for something profound about the human spirit. And when Christians can point to those stories and say, that's the God we serve, we don't have to make movies that have a certain perspective. We just need to point to truth when we see it. And to say, that's the God that I know. So part of our ministry is coming alongside these incredible stories that are being told. And speaking of God, they're interrelated without being one and the same. And in there is how we can influence culture.
Well, it's very interesting, you know, to understand, as you said, that Hollywood is upstream from politics, and in a sense, these actors or these Hollywood celebrities can become worshipped.
Absolutely.
And that becomes kind of a psychological thing, right? So now if you're this person who's being worshipped and you're having cultural influence, all of this can kind of have a weird effect, I would think, on the individual who, as you said, one day is very celebrated and nobody wants to call him back, sometime after. So have you ever had the ability to work with these people and help them find a light or a path that has them put all this in context and live a rich life spiritually?
Well, I'm going to say yes, sometimes, and sometimes there are actors who I'm still in touch with who I think I became a surrogate mother to, that I didn't know how else to be their representative. I love them ferociously, and I loved them in who they are. And we, maybe a couple times I talked about my faith, but certainly not from you must believe what I believe, but what they experienced from me is love. And so I would say that's a spiritual experience. There are other times where there were more direct things, particularly with young women who, my job as a talent agent was to bring, I wasn't a gatekeeper. People didn't hire me to be a Christian talent agent and make sure that nothing non-Christian comes across my desk. That was the farthest thing from who I was. My job was to put as many opportunities for work in front of actors as I could. And they weren't all clean and nice. A lot of them were brutal, bloody, and those are the movies. That's TV. And if there was interest in one of my actors, my job was to put that script in front of them and say, they're interested, what do you think of this part? And sometimes they would enter into a discussion with me. Sometimes they would say, I love it, book it. It's like, that's my job, I'll do that. But of the times where they would say, this one scene disturbs me, and I'm not sure why, what do you think? That's what opened up dialogue, to say, well, since you've asked, I think that's going to objectify you in a way. So if it was sex, a sexually simulated scene, whether it was language, whether it was a woman being brutalized. There was a gal that I represented who, in the course of the time that I represented her, when I first met her, she had come out of like a Playboy background of a darling girl. And then she got married, and then she said, my husband doesn't want me to do as much stuff that I used to do, and so can you help me? And I'm like, yes, I can. Like, let's talk about that from your perspective, what that means to your marriage. How does this part affect your relationship with your husband? And then she had a baby, and she had a baby girl. And now there was the possibility of saying, whatever you shoot, it's going to be out there forever. And someday, your little girl is going to ask you about this. And I want to have that conversation. How do you feel about that? And so I never said, I think you should or I think you shouldn't. I got the opportunity to have more of the Aristotle, conversation, to have them consider. And for her to go, oh my gosh, I don't want my baby girl to have to even consider this in her life, much less watch her mother act it out. That became a very clear choice for her, and a moral choice, which impacted a relationship, and that's where fear comes in. See, people don't want to make moral choices because they believe that there's a fear factor here, that if they say no, they'll never have the opportunity to work for that person again. And so the job to say, so what? If that happens, if you're the person that I think you are, and you're the actor that I think you are, and if you have the confidence in who you are, and you don't want to do this kind of work, but you're willing to do it because you're afraid that that person will never come back to you, can we stand against that together, against the fear? And can we come against that and say, that's going to be okay? Because there's going to be plenty of other people who are going to want the opportunity to work with you. And I don't care what it is. There are times in any career where fear and power they press in. And we make choices that are fear-based. So Hollywood's no different from any other place where we make fear-based decisions. And one of the most powerful things that God taught me when I was first a Christian, I think it's the signature verse of Scripture over my life. Perfect love casts out fear. We have no concept of perfect love outside of God? Well, how can perfect love actually do this? But if you were going to cast an action hero whose job, his superpower is to cast out fear, well, that to me is who the Lord is. That's who Jesus is. Like, that's this person who comes into each one of our lives that says, you know what I'm afraid of? I'm gonna take care of that for you. Well, how does he do that? How does he say, don't be afraid? Which is throughout Scripture. Don't be afraid. You're standing in the face of war. You're standing in the face of famine. And God says, don't be afraid. Well, I'm pretty afraid. So how is your presence going to change that? And how that happens is that God comes and says, I will be with you. And I'm not here to be known through circumstances. If the famine happens, I'm still God. I still love you. So how do you experience famine in such a way where God is still present to you? And when you can shift that paradigm and understand that God is not known through circumstance, that God is known because of God, because of presence, because of his unrelenting pursuit of being known to us. Well, now that means that you can be diagnosed with cancer and still know that God loves you. For many people, those things feel like polar opposites. If I'm diagnosed with cancer, that means that God doesn't love me. But faith teaches us, no, God is there. So you put that now, Hollywood seems like not such a big deal, right? But fear is so prevalent. So when you can stand and say, you're being called to something, and I'm talking about to people that aren't believers, you're being called to something, your spirit is speaking to you, that you don't feel right about this, say no. It's okay to say no. And the power of no is more powerful than the fear.
Right.
And so these factors of the people then that live in LA, that are brushing shoulders with those celebrities, with those celebrity directors, you now stand in a place that they're not quite sure how you stand there. How do you be that person who's not afraid? And that's where, you get some Teamster truck driver that says, oh, dude, you're driving him back to his room at night. And he's like, man, how is it that you're always happy, always kind, and I don't see you responding in fear to all the other stuff that people are responding to? I've heard this story. Oh, dude, it's because I love the Lord. What? Tell me about that.
Right.
So when there's a pervasive sense of that, or when we can start to have the aroma of that, you actually have the opportunity for people to live in this city, to live in any city in the world, in a holistic way and not in a broken way.
Is the reciprocal also true in the sense that maybe there are Hollywood celebrities or people of influence that have faith, but if they express it, they could be ostracized or marginalized because they have an expression of faith? I think there's probably examples of that. And what should their response be in your mind?
That absolutely is true. That a lot of times when people are outspoken about their faith, they get pigeonholed. So whether they get blacklisted or they get pigeonholed, that can absolutely happen. So there's the expression of being wise. Be wise. Know when to speak and know when to be silent. And to be silent is not a repudiation of what you believe. You still get to live into what you believe. You get to show up in the office or on the set and live out your values without having to speak of them. And then if somebody asks you in a conversation, why are you this way, then you speak of it in that conversation. If Christianity is an agenda that somebody's pushing, it lacks authenticity. And so actually, the more people that just want to live their faith authentically, the way anybody else wants to live their identity authentically, it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Of how the world today wants to be the champion of people who want to live authentically. Unless you're Christian, then we don't want to hear about that. And
Sort of a double standard.
kind of a double standard. And so I think that Christians are finding that place we have as much right to live authentically as anybody else does, to speak of who we are, to speak of our identities, not as an agenda, but as our reality that means something profound to us. And so we get to put that in dialogue with other people that share that value. And that creates opportunity. That's what we call an inflection point. And when Christians can rethink those paradigms, rethink values, I think we open up the possibility of dialogue and of knowing each other better. I think that a lot of the world, and especially here in Hollywood, I think that people come to Hollywood because of its influence with a lot of agendas. I want to get a movie made about this. And those are never the best movies. Agenda-driven movies are not good stories. Storytelling is you tell the story and you let it affect people the way it's going to affect people. We once showed a film, it was The Visitor. We put Haas Slayman in that film. And they had promised us a West Coast screening. And so I wanted the screening to be here for the constituents of Bel Air Church. And well, it so happened that Tom McCarthy had also promised his sister, who was an ACLU advocate, because that film was about speaking for, it was illegal immigration, speaking for the voiceless. And so they had promised the ACLU the premiere. So the last minute they said, we have this really unusual thing, but we need to put Bel Air Presbyterian Church, the home of Ronald Reagan, in the same screening as the ACLU. Okay, and I hosted that conversation.
Right.
So we have an ACLU advocate, we have Haas Slayman, who's Muslim, and we have one of the pastors from Fuller Seminary, a professor from Fuller Seminary, also a pastor. And I'm trying to weave together this conversation. And towards the end of the night, it was so beautiful, and you couldn't have orchestrated this moment any better. Somebody from, it was kind of funny because they sat in different places in the theater, and somebody from the ACLU raised his hand at the end of this conversation, and he said, I get why the ACLU's here. This is our film. We speak for the voiceless. I understand why the actor's here. I have no clue why your Christians are here. Why are you, what does this movie have to do with you?
Right.
And I loved it. I looked down at Paul Pearson, who was professor, and he'd been a missionary around the world, one of the gentlest spirits you've ever, and I said, Paul, you want to take that one? And Paul said, oh, absolutely. And in this kind, gentle, fatherly voice, he said, this movie that speaks of this one who, as a friend to the friendless, a voice to the voiceless, that's how we see our Lord. And to the extent that we follow him is to the extent that we can say that we're Christian. This movie speaks to us because it speaks of him. And you could hear a pin drop. I don't think the ACLU, with a broad brush, had ever considered Jesus Christ in those terms, to say he is on the same page that you are. You just think that Christians aren't. And that's a wake-up call to Christians, it's to both, right?
Right.
But Christians have to change how we speak of God, how we speak of Christ. If the only thing is that we put another notch on the belt is that we got one more, that's not who Jesus is. Jesus is about loving a person. Right. And so I think that's a long way around answering your question, but there are very wise, incredible people of faith who just do their work and do it with excellence and do it with kindness, and they are in positions of incredible influence.
And I think the idea of civil liberties is something that's not something that would be off-putting to Christians. Obviously, civil liberties is a foundation for loving human beings.
Martin Luther King was he was a pastor of a church.
Right.
And that's, in the modern era, that was a pastor of a church who, in a theological way, said we cannot have inequality. And that's absolutely what the church must embrace.
Yeah, and so there you have it. So there's alignment in areas that somehow, it seems like there's people that try to create polarization where none exists.
Right.
And that's an interesting thing to observe, and interesting firsthand that you got to do via screening of a movie. That these varying people come together that seem like an odd assembly.
Yeah.
So when you now are out there, because you've had your context from where you started, where you are now, you're in this unique environment called Hollywood, and have a lot of years of experience in it. And you recognize your pre-Christian self in other people who are in the jungle as you described it. What is the compulsion you feel inside, if any, to reach out and to kind of share with them?
The compulsion is to love them. And the compulsion is to enter into conversations about their values. And, it's funny, there was a gal, I'll tell you another story. There was a gal who was very new age when I was working at the talent agency. And we had this really weird room. It was a really odd shaped room. And she was all about feng shui. And she used to say, your office is horrible. It's horrible feng shui. Like, there's really bad things that are going to happen in here because of the feng shui. And I'm like, okay, I've been there, done that. Like, I don't think anything of that. So it was kind of like this trapezoid. And this one day, another agent that was working there was trying to take some aspirin, and one of them dropped and rolled under the desk, and she climbed under the desk and she screamed. And it's like, what? I thought it was like a dead mouse or something. And she said, there's rocks down here. There's rocks like this. And I'm like, what? And she goes, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to touch it. So this sweet, sweet girl had been so concerned about the feng shui in our office that she actually placed crystals in our office in this corner where she said all the bad energy was. So I crawl under, and here's somebody that doesn't want to touch the crystals because they think all the bad energy has been sucked up into those crystals. And so now we're on our hands and knees under this desk, and I grab the crystals and the aspirin that had rolled there, and I said, these are rocks. The only thing that has any power is that aspirin. That's the only thing that it can affect your mind and your body right now, is that aspirin. These are rocks. They do not have power. There is power in the world. There is power that we can't see, but it's not here. And so then to be able to go back to this sweet girl and take these crystals and to say to her, this was so sweet of you. Thank you for how you want to care for us and protect us. And then to say, with these crystals in my hand, to say, I used to believe in the healing power of crystals, the protective power of crystals, but I just don't believe it anymore. So, and she said, why? And that's how we entered into that conversation. If I had come to her and thrown the rocks at her and said, how dare you? That would have been completely different. Her desire was to love us. And if you take something like, I don't know if you want to talk about this or not, but even the abortion issue, right? Which is as divisive an issue as you can get with Christians on both sides, right, and with non-Christians on both sides. At the heart of that is valuing a human being on both sides.
Right.
And so how do we take that value, when you talk about the strange bedfellows, of rather than standing opposed, how do we say, at the heart of what's important to you is the value of the mother, and what's the heart of what's important to you is the value of the unborn child? Is there a way to value both of those without having to sometimes literally kill the other?
Right.
There's got to be some way that we can value these things. We just haven't found the answer yet. And so how do we do that? And the more that we force our agendas without listening, I mean, gosh, what's happening in America right now is so sad, that we just don't listen. We just want to get our point across. And that's not who Jesus is. Jesus did as much listening as he did talking. And Jesus never forced himself really upon anybody. He stood against the religious community, honestly, of that time, because it wasn't authentic. And so we have to find ways that we model that without trying to overshout, overspeak, drive our point home. We gotta find ways of coming back to civil discussion. You know, it's interesting. William Wilberforce, who championed ending slavery in England, and did it through their government. We went to war, right? We killed each other over that issue. Wilberforce legislatively kept attacking that issue, legislatively. The next most important issue next to slavery was civil discussion. That was what if he hadn't gotten sick, that's what he was going to take up next, is how can we gather together as citizens of this country and talk to each other in such a way that we can have a civil discussion as opposed to a civil war.
You had a business partner. Was she of the same faith or no?
No, which is, the beauty of our agency is, as I said, we weren't a Christian agency. We were an agency. And I love her so much. She sometimes, obviously, she knew who I was, and she was Jewish from Long Island. And sometimes she'd go to temple, the High Holy Days, and she'd come in and she'd say, "Kimmy, what does this mean?" And I'd say, "Oh my gosh, that's my favorite part of your religion." and I'd say, this is, whatever it was that she had asked, to talk to her from Hebrew scriptures and then say, this is what that is. And she'd be like, wow, like, I don't know that I ever learned that about the Jewish faith. And then she's like, how come you know about it? And I'm like, well, because that's the only lens we have as Christians. Is we would not have the key to understand anything about Jesus if it were not for the Hebrew scriptures, for the Jewish faith, for the Jewish nation, for the Jewish experience. All of that comes to us in Jesus, and then that's the only way. And so we would have the best talks in our agency, take a break and have our minute of theology or whatever it was. And the other agent that worked there was Catholic, and we would just have incredible talks that weren't just about theology. Sometimes they'd end up with us, dancing to rap music because we just needed to finish our break that way. But it was such a great open environment just to talk to each other. And that's what we need to inspire. That's what we need to be a part of, is to see the beauty in who other people are, and then not to be afraid of speaking. Like, this is my brother is where I was before I came to faith. My brother is an incredibly intelligent guy, and science fiction, lover of science fiction. And when the TV series Lost was on, he hadn't started watching it yet, and I'm like, you should check out this TV show. I loved it. That TV show was a bridge between us, where he would say, it seemed like there was a really important scene with Jack, and I don't get why it was so important. And I'd be like, dude, that was where you see God. That was like him understanding transcendence and significance and calling. And my brother would be like, what? Like, I didn't see that. And I'm like, that's there. And then there'd be times where I'd say, you know what, there was like a swan that was on and he was like, oh, that's a Buddhist symbol for X, Y, and Z. And we were unveiling layers of meaning that the storytellers had just layered in. So it wasn't the point of the story, and yet without those, the story was told more deeply when you could have those conversations and share these worldviews. They inform each other. Yeah. And so those were conversations that I got to have with my brother about a TV show.
It's amazing where you can find metaphor in things and then maybe build bridges like that.
That's right.
Which, I guess in kind of looking at the composite of your life and experience. So here you are, you find yourself in this unusual place called Hollywood and having a long-standing career in that place and dealing with all the, maybe lack of a better term, rhetoric that goes with that. And yet you have this spiritual path, you know, that you've walked down, which has landed you here, and doing the work that you're doing. What is the legacy that you hope to achieve, you know, through the efforts that you're making in your everyday life now?
Legacy is such a great word. Of what's the point of the work we do? What's the point of the conversations that we have? I would hope that part of my legacy has to do with, we talk about objectifying people. I think that Jesus Christ may have be more objectified than any person in the history of humanity. That he stands for things and stands for and against things. And I would hope that part of my legacy would be to humanize Jesus for others, to speak of him the way I came to know him. Here's another story, great story. There is one of our directors in the student ministries was just this great young guy. He works in entertainment as well. He actually does audio and entertainment, but works with our kids here. And he was driving home, and there was this kid, teenager, that was walking down the street, and he was wearing this T-shirt that, in a nutshell, said, F the Lord. And in so many words. And he's like, and his heart starts racing, and he's like, oh my gosh, what should I do? What should I do? And he loves kids, and he loves the Lord. And so rather than just driving by, just being insulted, he pulls his car over, and he gets out of his car. And he stands, he goes, well done. And the kid's like, who are you and why? He goes, you wanted to make a statement with your T-shirt. Well done. Like, you did it. Like, you have got my attention. So he goes, I'm curious, do you know him? Because I do. He's actually a friend of mine. And he goes, I wonder if you would say that if you knew him. And just as a friend of his, I hope that one day he's a friend of yours too, because he's a really cool guy. Got back in his, like, how beautiful is that we get to humanize Jesus. So I want that to be part of my legacy of this is not a concept, this is not a religion. This is not about insisting on doctrine or our ways. This is about how we honor and follow this friend who changed our lives. And I would love it if that's my legacy.
You know, I have to tell you, that story, it moved me. And I'm not even sure why. But it's just, because as you were communicating it, it was, you know, I had this kind of like visceral reaction that was negative. And to me, you know, you use a term that is, you know, you use the term transcendence. And that's probably a really good example of it, you know, the personification of it, saying that you get to a point where rather than outrage is the response, is that there's some sort of understanding, there's a preservation of love in something that seems pretty vile and offensive, and then there's a message that is not an edict,
That's right.
but an invitation.
Couldn't have said it better.
Yeah, so I really appreciate you sharing that story. I so admire you know, what you're doing and what you have done, and I really appreciate you taking time to talk to us today.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Patrick, and thanks for the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Me too. Thank you.
You're welcome.